Yeah. So this is the third of our virtual panel discussions that are being planned by the Center for New Economics Studies. As some of you who are from the university already know that the center's team has been working, I would say, pretty hard over the last three months to try understand what kind of crises we have been hit by. I think it's a lot of people tend to talk about the pandemic and the virus spread, but in the context of India particularly, the pandemic has been combined with another major shock, which was a curfew-style lockdown that we were all brought under way back in mid of March. Now, the lockdown, I would imagine, has imposed a far deeper and a bigger crisis as uh, even in comparison to the pandemic, because of the kind of impact it has caused on different groups, communities, and particularly and most importantly, the unorganized informal segment, which was, I would say, something that everybody was aware of, but it never got that principle of focus or attention amongst the general masses um, in context to our lives in the pre-pandemic world. One positive that I can definitely see is that a lot of us who are generally talking about issues of migrants, workers who are self-employed, the casual worker, the contractual workers, a lot of these issues were predominantly focused on by a group of scholars working in these areas, and talking about these issues in more intricate detail, in more nuance amongst those chambers of deliberation there. I think one of the effects and the impacts of the crisis was that the images that we started seeing emerging from the mid of March, I would probably say resonate with our own version of two events, two major shocks that had hit one South Asia and one, I would say, the world political economic landscape. I would say the first one is that of the partition. Not many people in our own generation are aware of the history or the memory of partition. All we get to know is through stories of previous generations, mostly our grandparents and what they know. A lot of people who have got lived experiences of the Second World War and saw those years of the war itself are aware of the kind of crisis that they were all affected by. The third event is that of the Great Depression. There was a column that I'd written way back in February second week for a newspaper, which had asked me to do like an analysis of what or how the COVID situation may affect India. And at that point of time, I wrote something, and the newspaper editors were not too keen in carrying it because they said, "Well, it seems what you're drawing out seems far-fetched." And I had argued at that point of time that maybe we're entering a phase where nothing would seem to be ever as what we would consider as before, in terms of the societal structures. A lot of the exacerbations of social divides would come on the surface, and India would experience what we would call as our own history or version of the Great Depression. This is not prophetic, but it just seemed that that was how the scenario was playing out in country after one after another. I think we got the situation on a completely different footing by this unilateral announcement being made that we just need to shut down everything at all at the same time. So it's very important that based on the discussions we've been having in the last two Saturdays, and I know I've been taking a lot of your Saturday evenings in coming up with these ideas and discussions, but the first discussion we had was focusing on two of the aspects of the economy. So I just want to kind of briefly go into a little bit of that. The economy, we looked at the macroeconomic impact of the shock and also the microeconomic impact, looking at two particular segments, the healthcare sector and the education sector. We had two speakers who touched upon these aspects, and we got some very interesting insight on what's happening in the healthcare sector, which is a sector that is at the far receiving end of this whole crisis. And India was already moving towards a highly privatized asymmetric model of public provisioning of healthcare. We were moving more towards a US style model of private provisioning, and public delivery systems being good only in few selected states. And those states have responded well, whether it's Kerala, whether it's some of the northeastern states, even including Assam for that matter. Some of the states have done reasonably well. The second session we had last week was looking at the theme of social justice, because we also started seeing in the very initial few weeks of the pandemic spread, the way a lot of the issues, as against with almost anything in India these days, was communalized. It led in the US to a very different situation of a divide on a social level between the African Americans and what were seen as the white Americans, and the kind of protests we started seeing as part of the Black Lives Matter movement. So we had a fascinating discussion last week. We got a voice from the Caribbean with Mr. Singh talking about what they are facing in the Caribbean about a completely different scenario. So this Saturday, we thought we're going to bring a team of exceptional sociologists, social anthropologists, urban geographers, people who've been looking, largely people who've been working with the community. In other words, these are not people who kind of spending time out in, in closed doors and trying to understand, making sense of concepts, but building concepts from the grassroots level. And I think one of which we need more desperately than ever before. We need very, very innovative theoretical foundations in social science, and not using the word social sciences, but in social science generally, to be able to understand that what we are experiencing. So the positive that I was talking about is at least everybody today is talking about the migrants, right? And the workers who have been at the far receiving end for so long and for such a long period of time, not only in terms of poor wages or poor livelihood conditions. I used to often make this remark personally to a lot of people around who were close to me, working in different segments of the economy. It would take a major crisis and a pandemic or a healthcare crisis to make people realize what we are just, in a way ignoring in our day-to-day lives. I think that's what seems to have happened. People are now questioning about the nature of state responses. I never ever thought that a finance minister would at least make or mention street vendors in her remarks at any point of time, or even announce for some kind of support. Whether it has worked, whether it has not worked, we're going to look at all of those questions today. So without much ado, and I wanted to just build a little bit of context for our discussion today, because the social nature of the impact cannot be seen only from the perspective of one group. You don't only look at perspectives of caste, class, ethnicity, race, or gender as only aggregates that you want to focus. Communities, as the way we look at it, could be seen from the perspective of geography, from the perspective of their own cultural identity. And the question of identity often seems to, particularly in context to economists, being one of this, carefully put on the side aspect, where we put some assumptions in place that discussions around identity, the role of the state, is presumed or assumed to be in a better functioning mode. We are trying, at least within the center, and now we have a team of around 31 people, and a team of now committed 30 writers who have now signed up as columnists from universities, including Ashoka, the DU, NUJS, around 4 or 5 law schools, to be able to develop a more holistic understanding of seeing economics as a social science, so that you start by going on the grassroots levels at the ground to understand what areas you're studying, right? when I say areas, I'm talking about geographical areas or discipline areas, and try learning from the experiences of people at the ground, how they are defining a certain situation, and then make so I think the art of listening seems to be our own whether pedagogical or methodological framework as taking a step forward. So as we get started, I just wanted to point out two things. One, I'll briefly echo out some of the questions and some of the focal points that were put across to our uh, respective panelists for today. Um, Before I just get started, I think I need to, yeah. Yeah, so I'll just briefly kind of give a point so that everybody in the audience is aware of what we are trying to look at, and each panelist would be focusing. The format is very clear. Each panelist tends to speak for a period of around 10 to 12 minutes. We then open our discussion up for panelists to be able to speak and comment on each other's remarks, and also add anything that they feel they've missed out on. And we'll then open up for questions and comments. But what I request our participants always to do is to keep their questions coming in at the time when panelists are done speaking. Don't wait for a separate hour to be given to you for writing your questions. So keep those coming. I'll moderate it and I'll help you out. At the same time, what I'm going to do today at least is the center 2.5 months ago took a collective measure to initiate a research initiative by what we had called it as Shram Ko Naman. Shram generally represents labor, any labor, in the sense of labor of hard work, labor, or the group representing any degree of labor or hard work that they're representative of in their due service or in their due vocation. And Naman is, because we have a few people as international recipients, Naman is a sign of respect that we pay as a tribute to each of the workers. So each of the teams, there are 5 teams within the center that were doing contributions for as part of this initiative to understand the impact of this crisis on the working community and the working classes. And I would say that this amazing team of around 28 to 30 students have been working day in and day out. I've been on meetings all days throughout the day and coordinating with them. Some of them were going during this lockdown for interviews in the field, to interview farmers, to interview domestic workers. So a lot of them are here, they're part of the audience. And I'll be sharing some links of the studies that they've been able to come out. Some of the work will be featured in the month of July, which has taken a lot longer and is under due diligence review. So I would request also our respective panel members and those who faculty members who joined in for the session to take a look at some of these links when they get the time, and share any responses, feedback, or inputs or comments that you may have at a later stage. All right, let me get started then. So what were the key focal points that we'd asked panelists to look at for this particular session? We have with us Dr. Akriti Bhatia, who's the founder and the executive director of PAGAM. PAGAM stands for People's Association for Grassroots Action and Movement. I think this has been a very interesting journey for an organization like PAGAM as well, which has been trying to understand the issue of the working class in their principal focus for a period of time, but were then instrumental in providing immediate relief at the forefront of this crisis. So we want to hear from Dr. Bhatia and her own experience of what, in her understanding, has been the scale of impact seen on the ground. To what extent does she feel that the role of the state has been able to address or not address the concerns? I mean, a country like India, as you guys know, no amount of support would really help. But few of us, we've been writing and arguing about it, that the directionality of government response has been, I would say, almost reminiscent of a laissez-faire approach. So the term that the Prime Minister uses is Atmanirbhar, but it's Atmanirbharta not by choice or an enhancement of capabilities, but you're pretty much left on your own to take care of your own self. That's the way at least I've been personally seeing, but we want her to engage and also talk a little bit about the role played by social organizations. I guess I forgot to get an M in the caps earlier with Pegam. We have with us Dr. Mara Nogueira. I mean, Mara would be talking with us about her own work, which has been focused on the unorganized informal segments of the economy in Brazil, the narratives that she can bring us from Brazil's own scenario, how this is likely to change the ecosystem of cities as and when this is over. And someday, in some point of time, this will be over. We will be seeing a very different form of an urban or rural arrangement and societal relations. So we want Mara to be able to talk about that. We have with us Professor Sugandha Nagpal, who is an assistant professor with the School of International Affairs. She's also, you guys, I think a lot of people at the university would have been aware that the Center for Migration and Mobility Studies were sharing some excellent articles and reads to help us understand the context of the crisis. So what are the ways in which one can understand the migrant worker, let's say in context to India, and develop more responsive policies? That's a question that Sugandha will be approaching. We have with us a political sociologist and a political anthropologist, or a social anthropologist. That's the way I was trying to understand her work, is Professor Lipika Kamra from the School of Liberal Arts and Humanities. She will be bringing to us a perspective on what she sees as the socio-political impact of the crisis. We have seen an increase in, would define probably militant authoritarianism, not only across in India, but almost for pretty predominantly a number of countries across the world. And we have with us, hopefully, Professor Swargajyoti Gohain from Ashoka University, whose work has been focused a lot on the border communities across regions, to help us understand how the current situation has affected the border communities itself. Borders are right now in discussion for a completely different reason. But if you, till the time you do not engage and go and spend a little bit of time, and I would say by experience that till the time you don't spend a little bit of time understanding what the lives of people at the border is like, I don't think you can get a better understanding of any social, economic or political issue to the same extent. With that, I will ask and given the floor to Dr. Akriti Bhatia. Akriti, we'll probably get started. Yeah, go ahead.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Right. Thank you so much for organizing this, and it's really good for a change to be part of this all-women panel. So thank you for that. And so given the fact that we've been on ground during the pandemic, COVID crisis and the lockdown, which is another very big onslaught that was there on the working class, there are 3 to 4 processes simultaneously at a macro level that I want to first lay out. And then I will be talking about politics of relief itself, because being part of it and having been exposed to the dynamics of how it works, I think that's very important to bring out. And the third thing that I would like to highlight is where women workers stand in all of this. So, so this pandemic, especially in the Indian context, has actually exposed the deepest fault lines of our country. I think it's unseen anywhere else in the world. The way the sites of millions of migrant workers returning, and it's actually nowhere else been so dismal, is what we've actually seen. So there's this, the first thing that one found was the fragility of the urban, that there's such over dependence on large markets, on availability of work, on different trade relations, that the dismantling was so sudden with just one announcement, especially for the people who were daily wagers. So that was one. And also within this, tied closely to this urban idea, is the redundancy of capitalistic artifacts like big hotels, malls. I mean, there was complete redundancy of spaces like these, and one would like to elaborate on how these spaces could have been used, and how creatively the responses could have actually been thought of and implemented. So that's the second thing. Yet there is a greater flexibility of capital that one found with simultaneous coming in of COVID products, of digital platforms seeing a huge boom, and e-commerce coming in. So people were trying to argue that this pandemic is really challenging capitalism in a big way. We really need to, I think, through this and come up with our responses as well. And at the same time, the simultaneous process that one could actually identify if one would travel beyond the urban is the resilience of the rural. I think that is also very important, because the local subsistence production and consumption was majorly unaffected in rural spaces. They didn't still masks didn't reach there, and I think it's a very good thing that still the pandemic hasn't reached in the countryside as much. So I think these are some of the processes that we have to simultaneously look at as macro processes that are taking place. So coming in with coming to the idea of relief work that Professor Mohan has pointed out in terms of how we've been actively, and so many others players at individual capacities with social organizations who've actually done brilliant work in terms of providing rations, safety kits, and other kinds of assistances to people who are direly in need. So the three things that were actually the reason why the disaster, I would say, took place was the issue of housing, which is shelter, because rents were still being sieged. Of course, food security, despite having a National Food Security Act, was absolutely a very major concern that didn't reach people. And the third, of course, is work. So food, housing, and work were the three reasons why distressed migration from rural to urban took place. But at the same time, because the cities could not provide these adequately, that reverse migration happened. So these were the three things based on which a lot of responses were also focused on. But you very rightly mentioned about this whole idea of Atmanirbharta is being left to oneself. But the question of Atma Samman was actually deeply hit with this entire relief work as well. Atma Samman would translate to self-respect, which was actually something bigger, which meant much more than even getting food or freebies or relief material. So one just felt that how inadequate, how disaggregated and unsustainable these ration kits and all of these efforts were, because the government, of course, one could easily conclude has been at a very big failure. I'm talking more in terms of Delhi NCR, where our work was centered to mostly, and there was this obsession with having lists of people, having their documentation, pictures in place, then coming up with the numbers of people you've served, and this whole obsession with so it really deeply affected and the self-respect of whom we keep calling beneficiaries. So one also found NRC style extension of policies, even where government was undertaking relief work. It's still going on. Why I say is that because Aadhaar card became something very important when you are providing a ration kit to somebody. So just taking two examples of people, of sections that we worked with, one being sex workers and the other waste pickers, who were mostly in areas like Simapuri, Jahangirpuri, Bengali Muslims, who were very, very apprehensive and fearful of the fact that this could actually, giving out their IDs would actually, have ramifications when NPR, NRC would take place. So it's not that the clampdown that was happening just before. We saw Delhi riots, and the riot affected localities were actually multiple times received more distress as a result. So these were like real issues that came in, where people were very apprehensive of sharing their identities and what would follow in terms of the questions of their legalities and others. then also, while talking about these ID cards, it was a huge issue with respect to, say, something like ration cards. If one had a ration card, it was an issue that they were not entitled to get the ration kit. But if they did have it, if they didn't have it, then also it was a big problem, because if it was in the countryside, so portability of ration cards was a very important issue, although it was raised in some of the policy suggestions. It came up, but of course it has not been implemented, and that was a huge gap that took place. So another very important political question. Of course, it's a political demand for food, for housing, for work. But I'm talking about direct electoral politics that is very much to do with the voter IDs of these workers, which again is not portable. So therefore, we will see that they do not have that kind of a bargaining power uh, in the cities or the destination cities where they come and work. So it was never that the governments would actually cater to their demands. It's not just during the pandemic, but historically as well, we've seen how their interests are mostly left out. So, when we talk about social actors or NGOs and social organizations, it's a very mixed response that I would say, because it's as I mentioned, um, as much as you do it, it's very inadequate, because next week the ration kits would finish for a family of five, or maybe just the next meal. It's a big question. So it's not something sustainable, of course. The other thing is that the efforts were very disaggregated. The government could have come in at different levels of trying to actually create that database and create that synergy of donors, of beneficiaries. All of that didn't happen. Coming to the funds is, of course, a very, very huge issue in itself, where we still don't know how PM CARES fund is being spent or was being spent. So that, of course, with the accountability question, is still little displaced. And one also felt that it's like this temporary diversion of discontent that these organizations end up doing. It's a postponement of that discontent and that articulation that should happen on the streets politically, as we see how in the US, despite the pandemic, people are actually out on streets. So the responses are therefore curtailed with relief work of this kind, and we really need to be very mindful. At the same time, having said that, if these organizations were not there, one can bet that the death rates and the starvation rates would have been way, way higher. So I think both things we need to be very mindful of, and how concerted efforts with the government is so essential. We do within our country have very good examples, like the Kerala government, in which local government and the apparatus has been taken into account, and even an organization like Kudumbushri, which is an NGO run by the government, has a very, very different way of how things play out, and therefore the success story of the state as well. Finally, how much time do I have so that I can pick up the issue of gender
I
and
would say
the
probably around 2 to 3 minutes. That's okay.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So specifically with respect to women workers, as I mentioned, we did work closely with sex workers, and when we talk about this whole world of work being shattered with this kind of a pandemic, it was very true for even sex workers who were already so vulnerable, and their idea of work itself was. So we also went not just to red light areas like GB Road, but also home-based sex work, which is even further hidden. I mean, something that many people wouldn't even acknowledge as work. That is completely hit, and with the entire stigma of social distancing and all, their work is not even going to be resumed in any time in future. So when you talk about undocumented and unorganized workers, like unorganized work like sex work, I think we should use the term insecure work. It is really a very big problem in terms of how their livelihoods will actually come into picture. And of course, it's not just about requirements of food. For example, what they needed were iron tablets. I mean, the more you will go and work with communities, one will find how customized their needs would be. So that is something that is very important. The second was our experience with domestic workers. And with domestic workers, of course, we know similar social distancing stigmas were in place of why people would not, urban middle class households would not employ them. And these domestic workers basically, even when the PM had announced that now we are opening up, I think this was lockdown one, unlock one in May, when the PM has said that self-employed workers will be allowed to resume their activities like plumbing and all other sorts. So even domestic workers were supposed to fall in that category. But then RWAs and other units were very apprehensive and wouldn't allow domestic workers to resume work. So the and of course they didn't have any paid leave. All these a lot of studies showed that all these middle class households refused to pay salaries to these domestic workers, saying that if you never worked and we actually did our own housework, so we do not owe you anything. So it's that kind of a thing that you do see social sector coming up, but at the same time there's a huge apathy that still people found. So the whole thing about also migrant workers, the imagery is still very male driven. There were also so many women who actually walked back, and the kinds of issues that they had again were very severely more intense with pregnant women, with women who are lactating, and with all kinds of different kinds of health requirements that they had, and different challenges that they had in their journeys back home. And also this whole um, uh, so many of these were forced reverse migrations. So I think women have been at a much more difficult space. Even when one would go and distribute kits, men would actually send their women counterparts to collect the ration kits because of the entire question of dignity. So even during this pandemic and the lockdown, women were doubled up with responsibilities of carrying 20 kgs of ration kits, taking them back home, and then cooking. So I'm talking about, of course, families, working class families who are here. Of course, male workers were single working here, had to come and collect their own relief material. So these were different kinds of issues that we came across, and it was very important to actually see relief work not as something which is apolitical and positive. It also has a lot of complexities and problems of its own. So there are many more points. Hope to take that up in further discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much, Akriti. I mean, we already have a lot of question, comments, and I think they've been shared with me, and we'll probably come back to this because you've raised, I think, 3 very critical points. One is on this question of identity, which is the documented identity, a point which was being earlier echoed by, I would probably argue, a number of scholars who were doing work and in areas whether Aadhaar and the effectiveness of Aadhaar, and the issue around whether social security, which you try to ensure through a document, can actually ensure that in the circumstances when you need it the most. And the number of suggestions that were being made on temporary ration cards just to ensure that delivery of food distribution could happen. I was seeing here in villages across Haryana that within the rural community itself, more than the state, actually, it was the peer community there which was far more engaged in providing basic ration and ensuring that even though the laborers who could not travel back were getting basic supplies. But this other question which you pointed out later, and I think that's something which we want to probably get back to on late at a period of time, is this question of insecure work, and looking at this, how do we define work going forward? Because a lot of work, which whether it happens on law, determining legality, or seeing as a regulatory capacity, tends to have this conceptual problem which is so embedded, at least in a very divided, to a certain extent also fragmented social structure, where you don't really know. When we say the unorganized work, A lot of the work that we used to often see also in markets seem to be far as organized as it would be in a market, right? So how do we really see as the nature of work changing as we move forward? A lot of those questions were earlier restricted to debates and air-conditioned spaces discussing AI and impact of automation. Now it is throwing up a lot of questions up in the air. The final point which you made, and I think later on probably you can get back and explain more, is this question of how women, and this is interesting to observe that you say that at the time of ration delivery and supplies, most, let's say, men in the household were largely asking women to go out. So it seems that they were far more vulnerable, even in the process of, being getting access, but also at the same time being also more vulnerable to the spread of the virus. Of course, you're talking about this in context to what the organization was seeing in the National Capital Region. But with that, let me get Dr. Mara to come in. And I know Mara is listening to us and getting a little bit of perspective on what's happening in India. But could you help us understand on what's been the situation in Brazil, and our listeners would want to know more. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm kind of feel like I have a burden here because the situation in Brazil is obviously very complex, but I'll do my best and try to focus a bit on what was asked in relation to the working, like unorganized sector of the labor force. So I'd like to start just by thanking Dipanshu and the Center for New Economic Studies for the invite and to be part of this discussion. We've been discussing previously, me and Dipanshu and other colleagues who work in India, how Brazil and India share some similarities, but also some important differences. And I think that understanding both of those aspects in the pandemic is a very relevant exercise that can be very helpful to enhance our understanding of both realities. So I think that one of the key similarities is the topic of my presentation today, which has been already touched on by the previous panelists, which is the impact of the pandemic and the lockdown on the informal economy. So just before I get to that point more specifically, I would just like to contextualize in a few words, because assuming that a lot of you have heard about the situation in Brazil, but you're not fully aware of the extent of the chaos in which we are. And so I'm gonna just share my screen to share a little bit of the most recent data about coronavirus crisis in Brazil. So Brazil is now the second in this infamous ranking of the just below the U.S. in both the number of cases and the number of deaths. And I was checking this last night to prepare the presentation, and the number of cases was at least 100,000 less than it is now, and the number of deaths was at least 1,000 less than it is now. So now we are reaching 1.2 million cases and more than almost 55,000 deaths, which is, of course, like a very huge impact. And just shared as well a bit of how that looks, because Brazil is a huge country. So we see that there's a lot of difference in terms of the impact on space. And you see that big regions such as São Paulo and Rio, which are the big metropolis of the country, are being hit the hardest. But we also see, for instance, in the north, the Amazon and the poorest part of Brazil, which is the northeast, being also affected very extensively. So I think that the one difference that we have in relation to India is that, unlike India, we didn't have an organized lockdown, and we can discuss if that's better or not. But unlike the majority of the countries in the world, Brazil suffers from a pandemic and a political crisis at the same time. So We have no leadership in the federal arena. Our president, Jair Bolsonaro, who is Brazil's famous far-right president, has consistently denied the gravity of the situation and even opposed measures to contain the pandemic, which have been proposed by governors and mayors. So his fallacious rhetoric is built on the notion that Brazil cannot stop, which sponsors the false dichotomy between saving the economy and saving lives. In the meantime, both two health ministers have resigned during the pandemic due to disagreements with the president in relation to initiatives to contain the pandemic. And as a result, Brazil has not had a health minister for the past 2 months in the midst of the biggest health crisis that the country has probably had in its history. So far, the only kind of consistent policy which has been implemented that I'm going to talk a bit more about in the presentation to address the impacts of the pandemic and the lockdown was the emergency income support of 600 Brazilian reais, which is less than 100 pounds per family.
Mara, just a second. I don't think we can see the PowerPoint, or are you using, are you not?
No,
Oh, you've stopped it. Okay, great. Thank you.
I'm just gonna use it again towards the end to show a bit of recent data, but now I'm afraid it's just me talking.
That's perfect. I thought you were looking at that. Sorry.
Okay, no worries. So the policy that has been implemented was this emergency support income, which is 600 Brazilian reais, or which is less than 100 pounds per family, which can be double that value for households which are headed by women. So initially, the government wanted to set the value on 200 but then the opposition proposed the bill 2 times that value. So we at least we have that. But it hasn't been perfect. Of course, the system of implementation has been criticized for constraining the access to certain households, but also the way that it's being implemented has also caused contamination in some cases. So there's been reports about the Amazon, for instance, when you have the indigenous people living in secluded communities, and to access the support, they have to go to the nearest town to withdraw the money, and then they end up being contaminated and coming back to their communities and then spreading the virus. So the indigenous community, unfortunately, has been hit quite hard as well by the crisis. But despite the constraints, I would say, sorry, that the emergency income has been quite celebrated by street vendors and other types of informal and unsecure workers whose livelihoods depend on their everyday work, either on the streets or in informal workshops and etc. And I think that one thing that it's quite interesting and also alarming about this crisis that is that unlike others, the informal economy, which has worked as sort of a cushion to accommodate the rising unemployment, the decreasing incomes of households, has now actually needed help. So it has been unable to accommodate shocks, and it has needed support as well. So it's a sort of quite different from crisis that we've observed before. In this presentation, what I want to do is discuss a bit more the impact of the crisis in the sort of sector of insecure workers. But what I would also like to say is that the crisis is kind of affecting the labor market, and not only informal workers have been hit, but a lot of people who were secure before have lost jobs or have reported lower incomes due to the situation. So we have people who will be moving into informality into the future, and also people who have been unable to work in sort of informal employment due to the crisis. So the situation up in Brazil right now, just before the first case was confirmed, we had data on the labor market, and we had then 38 million people in Brazil were considered to be in the so-called informal workers. So in 11 out of 27 states in Brazil, more than 50% of the workers were in the informal sector, and therefore fell outside the bounds of protective labor laws, right? Were unprotected. As I was saying, beyond informal work, a recent report by a group of researchers from Rede Solidária in Brazil has estimated that the pandemic will impact up to 81% of the country's labor force in different ways, therefore jeopardizing even the supposedly secure jobs. The pandemic is also putting at risk formalized workers in non-essential sectors, adversely affected by the negative demand shock. In this situation, vulnerability levels are enhanced by the combination of a conjunctural crisis and also combined with the long-term structural crisis of waged labor. So I'll argue that this worrisome scenario requires prompt reflection on new policy approaches to tackle the challenge created by the new world of labor. So what we have is a crisis that have hit a world which was already sick in a certain sense, right? From London and Madrid to São Paulo and New Delhi, the pandemic's revealing is an increasing levels of precarity engendered by the global restructuring of labor markets. Without the access to protective safety nets, workers in the so-called informal economy, as well as those in the gig economy, are unable to sustain livelihoods, or alternatively, they take high risks to keep working in search for daily survival. So in the global north, what we see is that pandemic exposes dismantled social welfare regimes, eroded by decades of austerity, neoliberal policies, and the continuous flexibilization of labor rights. And in the global south, what we see is the neoliberal restructuring has accentuated the unequal socioeconomic effects of the crisis and further demonstrated the exclusionary character and the limitations of a citizenship regime, which has been historically mediated by the formalized wage labor. So what we see in Brazil, as I think is the case in India as well, is that we had never have a significant proportion of our workforce covered by labor laws. And this situation has been becoming even more, even worse in the last decades because of neoliberal restructuring. So what this pandemic has shown is how we need policies that account for that, right? That account for the failure of welfare regimes in the global south. So we cannot sponsor types of policies which only consider waged workers, but we need to think about those informal and secure types of workers as well. And I would say that Brazil is similar to India, as Dipanshu was saying. It's for the first time, I would say, the situation of informal workers, of street vendors, has been actually on the agenda. So these workers have been sort of historically denied rights, and for the first time, in a way, their kind of like precarious situation has become somehow in the center of the debate, right? So I hope that this will prompt kind of discussions about new ways of doing policy rather than trying to restore a past that we never had, in a way. So I'm sure you know, and India is not, I think it's not in a much better position. Brazil is one of the most unequal countries in the world. So it's the 7th most unequal country in the world in terms of income distribution. And I would say that this inequality is very much represented in the heterogeneous labor market, which is of course stratified by race and gender amongst other aspects. So data for 2018 has shown, for instance, I'm going to show here a graph just to illustrate this. The difference between incomes between different genders and different races. So you see, for instance, that in the total workforce, a white person receives more than £100 more, £160 more per month than a white person. And if you look at the difference between white men, which on average receive £433 per month, and black women, which received £192 per month on average, you see how the difference here becomes even more stark. So how long do I have? Just so
I would say you'd probably conclude now. We could, and then come back to you later, because there are a few questions, so we'll just open it up then.
Okay, so I would just like to conclude then by showing then what I wanted to say with this is just to illustrate how then you have a situation in which you already have a sort of very unequal labor market. And obviously those who are most vulnerable are obviously the people in insecure jobs, but also Black women and Black men more specifically, right? They've been hit the hardest, not only by the pandemic, because you can see that the number of cases is also higher amongst the Black population, but also they have been hit the hardest by the social distancing measures that has caused, as I'm going to show like quickly now, a few indicators which have been released just 2 days ago, showing the impact of the pandemic on the labor force. So what we see here is that 14% of the labor force has lost jobs because of the pandemic so far. 3% has lost jobs for other situations. And in the situation which we already have 11% of people not working. So this represents 13.5 million people who have lost their jobs. Represents as well a situation in which 38% of the households has received this government emergency support. 18 million people who are still working have reported working less than normal. As a result, 13 million people have also reported a reduction in their incomes. And those who have been hit the hardest are the domestic workers. So 33.6% of domestic workers without contracts have lost their jobs during this pandemic. And in Brazil, the majority of the people who work as domestic workers are Black women. So we have the situation here that those have been hit the hardest. So just like a last slide that I would like to show is, I can talk a bit more about this in the Q&A, is a bottom-up initiative that I've been following as part of my own research in the city of Belo Horizonte, where I do my field work, which is the Center of Support to Street Vendors, who have been fundraising to distribute food and other types of materials to street vendors who have been also hit quite hard by this crisis. And I think that's all that I have to share for now, and I'm happy to expand a bit during the Q&A, and thank you very much.
So yeah, thank you, Mara. Thanks. I mean, I was taking my notes, and I think the point that you made on the heterogeneity of labor markets, I think that's something which we probably want to get back later on and get more, making contracts more secure for workers. That is going to be a principal policy question, which is just not an economic policy question, but a social policy question for most developing nations now. And I say this because it is most of the developing nations which have the fragmented, and I would say probably to a certain extent broken labor markets that have deep embedded and entrenched inequities that are systemic. Some of them are exacerbated by institutional mechanisms by themselves. And they're the question of legality, and earlier, for example, that Akriti was alluding to, that not having access to documents, in fact, make a lot of people to stay away from regulatory practices. And in fact, then most of them don't get benefits. Just to give you a statistic, that the government support package as part of a scheme called the Jan Dhan Yojana, which was financial inclusion of measure to include people to have bank accounts, had rupees 500, I would say in dollar figures, less than $10 of amount, 10 US dollars assigned to them as a transfer for a period of a month, which is which is 1.5 times the minimum wage for a worker working daily. It was that dismal, the amount of money that were given as direct transfers. So there is a lot that we need to get, I think, at some point of time, to get a better understanding on how countries which have almost broken labor markets, have huge issues around regulation, how do they come close to that and look at having policies that are more inclusive. Let me ask Professor Sugandha Nagpal at this stage to come in, because Sugandha wanted to get and look a little bit at the question of response and policies, and then we can have Lipika and Swargajyoti coming in, talking about their own stories. So Sugandha, please proceed. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Dipanshu. It was very interesting listening to the two speakers before me. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
All right. So I'm just going to put this on. There we go. All right. So what I want to talk a little bit about today is the idea of how the migrant labor has been understood in the Indian context, and how that has incapacitated and disabled policy making that is responsive to the needs of the migrant laborer. And not just policy, this is also reflected in the way that the media spells out the issues of migrant laborers. It sort of informs larger discourses about migrant laborers as well. And I mean, just going to start with some images that we saw splashed on Indian newspapers at the beginning of the first lockdown, which was in March. So this was a very common image of migrant laborers trying to get onto buses to get back to their home states. This was an image, of course, of migrant laborers carrying whatever meager belongings they have and trying to trek, walk back to their home states. So what had happened is that the lockdown was, announced abruptly. There was no sort of, kind of preparation or any kind of hint that it's going to happen, really. When it happened, migrant workers were sort of left high and dry, and they started to sort of make their way back home. Now it seems that the government was caught off guard. They didn't predict that this was going to happen. And you were left, and a lot of the stories that were coming out at that time, painted this image of vulnerable migrants that were, left in this situation. And initially, a lot of media accounts talked about how this is stemming from a loss of work. And because they don't have any work, that they're making this movement back. Over time, a more nuanced sort of narrative emerged, where we saw that was not only the loss of work that was motivating these migrants to go back home, but also concern about what's happening with their family, wanting to be with their family at this difficult time. Feeling a sense of separation, a lot of us feeling a huge sense of anxiety over the uncertainty that was going on. And I think this, was completely lost, and we see continuities in terms of, how the migrant labor is misunderstood and how that plays out in terms of policies and media discourses. And when we don't, and what happens is, in trying to view the migrant labor purely through the prism of their poverty, we lose sight of them as a human being, and how as a human being you're a complex being. You have multiple motivators, and this is a very simple point, really. It is not really something that's complicated or something that, but it is really often missed out in terms of how the government chooses to respond, in terms of how people choose to critique the government response, in terms of how media discourses play out their role. So it is something that, while very simple in terms of what it's trying to say, is something that's often overlooked, and I would like to argue has very negative ramifications as a result. So, what the government sort of initially started doing when the situation played out, the lockdown happened and migrant laborers tried to move back home. They said that we're going to provide them with some food, temporary shelter, and prevent them from returning home, lest they spread the virus. So the initial sort of knee-jerk reaction was to prevent them from going home, because that would lead to further spread of the virus. And someone else has already mentioned this, I believe Akriti made this point, but the Kerala government, was unique and continues to be unique in the way that they're managing this crisis, where they had a much more sensitized response. So they included, things like North Indian food, because a lot of the workers come from parts of India, where they eat particular kinds of food, recharging phones so that they could talk to their families. So, the Kerala response recognized that this was not just about treating people like they only need food and shelter. Of course, they need those things. But in addition, they also want to be recognized for the need to want to be with their family. And this was the government trying to play catch up. Kerala did a much better job of it. There were interventions by the Supreme Court, which, I found, as someone who's new to the Indian context, a lot of my work has been on international migration. I found this quite surprising that the Supreme Court has intervened at multiple counts. Not just with the migrant worker crisis, but also the handling of the Delhi government, for instance, of the pandemic. So on March 31st, which is after the first lockdown, the Supreme Court mandated provision of food, shelter, and medicines for humane treatment of migrants. And on June 9th, which is more recently, the Supreme Court intervened again to direct the state and center governments to send all the migrant workers to their native places within 15 days. Now, of course, there was already, after, the multiple waves of lockdowns that have happened, since May 1st, the government has already been trying to sort of arrange sending migrant workers back. Of course, a lot of them have already gone back on their own. They've walked back, or they have, paid for, some kind of bus transport to get them back. There were some state governments that sent migrant workers back, for example, the Delhi government, until the March 31st order, where it was halted, and they were housed in temporary sort of structures and given provisions. And then then on May 1st onwards, migrants were sent back through the government trains. And I have a question here, whether this was a good idea, and I'll come back to this. This idea of sending them back, and sending them back in a way without planning for bringing them back is the point. So of course, they want to go back home, and they should be able to go back home. But it's almost like the government doesn't think of the next step. Well, you would have to bring them back because they're an important part of running your industries in the city. So that seems to have been again lost, where, so since May 1st, according to, again, these figures, of course, and one thing to bear in mind with a lot of these discussions and the points even that I'm making is that, these figures are coming from news reports. So I'm not, there isn't, we will see, there will be some time more before we can actually have research and figures that can, really be substantiated. So at this point, you are trying to sort of get a sense of things. According to the figures, since May 1st, 5.7 million migrants have been ferried back home. And the Supreme Court on June 6 said that 90% of migrant workers who wanted to go home from their workplaces have been transported back. Of course, this was also not a smooth movement. So when they started, there were reports that the migrant laborers were being asked to pay for their journey back. And then there were multiple clarifications where the central government said that, we're not paying for it, it's the state governments that have to pay. So there was this, volleying that was happening between the central and state governments. Apparently, eventually it emerged that, they were being reimbursed by the state governments. There were also about 80 people that died on these journeys between May 9th and May 27th. And, in addition to sort of ferrying people back, the government also then started to talk about their rural integration. So then there was a sense in terms of policy responses that migrant workers have been sent back, and they'll stay back, and now they have to be integrated into the rural economy. So the bolstering of the Manrega program, which is of course also a way to sort of helping the poorest of the poor. So in addition to migrant workers, it's also another kind of larger social security net. As Dipanshu just mentioned, the Garib Kalyan Rozgar Abhiyan, which according to the Prime Minister is a scheme that has been inspired by migrant workers. They'll be provided jobs near their homes. And the idea is that so far they've been using their talent for the development of factories. Now they'll be helping their villages and their own neighborhoods. So about 50,000 crores is to be spent across 116 districts in 6 states, which is Bihar, Jharkhand, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Odisha, and Rajasthan. Now, this is again assuming that migrant workers are going to remain in the rural areas. But the migrant worker is unpredictable, and I mean, it's not really unpredictable if you kind of understand how people operate and how people who are in precarious jobs and are trying to make ends meet might operate. And now you see that the reports from Kerala, Haryana, Mumbai are revealing that migrants have started to come back. And what's interesting is a lot of this now move back to the city is actually sponsored by industries and companies who are trying to get industries started up. So there's a huge contradiction in terms of we want, or the government claims, and in fact, a lot of governments, not just the Indian government, a lot of governments are struggling with this, where they're trying to protect people, but they also need to start the economy. It was also pointed out by Mara in the case of Brazil. This seems, so it's a kind of universal kind of conundrum that governments are stuck with. But if you're trying to restart the economy, you need the labor force. So even if even if we're not for a minute looking at the humanitarian element of it, which of course should be looked at, as economic members, you need migrant laborers back to rework the economy. And so just, I mean, there's been a sort of simplistic logic. So first, the government did not think the migrant laborers would want to go home. Then they're like, oh, they want to go home, now we'll send them home. But now they wouldn't want to come back. So this kind of reductionist narrative about the migrant laborer, as someone that, is not a being with complex needs that are mediated by various factors. So again, when we're saying that, migrant laborers want to come back, of course, not all migrant laborers will be coming back. And there needs to be more work on what shapes the different the choices and the aspirations of different migrant laborers. But for example, someone say who has more has a livelihood strategy that has always been divided between the rural and the urban, and perhaps they have a bit of plot of land in the rural area that they're working with, they might feel more secure staying on a little bit longer. There might be others who, given that, I mean, at least the prediction is that wages will go up given the shortage of labor, who might feel compelled to make the move back because of higher wages. So the policy response has been, playing catch up, firefighting, knee jerk, not sort of coming from a place of recognizing that, migrants are, have diverse needs, and that your policy needs to emerge from that. And I mean, and in some sense, to me, this is a very basic tenet of anthropology and of ethnographic work, right? And bringing that to bear on what's going on with this crisis and how it can inform much more responsive policy reactions. And in addition to this takeaway that, sort of revisiting our view of the migrant laborer, this is also a productive moment to talk about rights of migrant laborers, as Dipanshu has just pointed out as well. This idea of, what is the social contract between the migrant and the employer? And actually, I mean, in the case of domestic workers and domestic labor, it comes forth in a really, really disturbing way as well, where, a lot of cases, you're hearing horror stories that people, are sending their live-in workers, domestic workers back home because they don't want to deal with the fact that, what if they get COVID and then we have to take care of them. And that is based again on this complete lack of any kind of whether social legal contract between domestic workers and their employers. So that is something really that one needs to revisit seriously, because I think that asking the state in a developing country where we know we have a weak state that is incompetent on many fronts, asking the state constantly to do things doesn't really work, and we know this. So perhaps trying a different kind of approach where you're incentivizing employers to take measures to provide some kind of social security net to the workers. And then this, again, people have talked about this. People like Tumbe, who do a lot of work on migrant workers, have also talked about this. So this is something that I think really needs to be thought about seriously. The registration and enumeration of internal migrants. I mean, this is something basic that, you know, we don't have a register of internal migrants. And yes, there's difficulties in trying to create that, but the benefit of creating that is that you can have targeted schemes. You can have, you can have a sense, the simple thing of ferrying migrant workers to their home state and back could have been done in a much more efficient way if we had some kind of registration process. And again, this is something that other people have also talked about. And what has also now come to the fore, so maybe, I'm hoping that at least from, that there might be some silver lining to all of this mess, that the government, might be forced to, examine some of the doormat policies that have been lying around. So, this idea of one nation, one ration card, which has been in the works for a very long time, has now again been reintroduced as something that's going to happen by March 2021, where basically one of the problems that migrant workers would have is that they would not be able to access PDS benefits when they're outside their home state. And this is sort of universalizing the ration card, so it's not just linked to your home state or where you've received it. And this is something, again, that there's been a lot of advocacy around, and something that needs to happen because it again provides the kind of social security net that migrant workers would need. And in fact, that is also one of the things that would prevent this kind of large exodus, and and would also make migrant workers feel much more secure in the environments where they're working. So I mean, these are just some large takeaways that I would like to leave you with, and I would like to sort of hear also what you have to say, and also up for discussion. But I mean, I think that it's really high time that we start, and this kind of transition has happened. When we talk about international migration, we don't talk about people as purely economic migrants and economic actors. We talk about people's aspirations about migration. We talk about the multiple sort of factors that lead people to migrate, that lead people to come back. So, I mean, to me, it's like, why haven't we made that transition when we talk about internal migrants? Is it because they're poor? And that means that's also reflecting on our ability to not overcome this idea of povertarianism, where we can't look beyond the poor category. And I'll leave it there. But
no, thank you, Sugandha. I mean, this was very helpful, and I mean, the kind of questions that you raise and you come up with, it's like we're just moving in a circle around some very central points of discussion. Like one question that I have, and I think that's a question which is coming up from others as well, and the same, I think, point is coming on the nature of the welfare state and what this welfare state is going to look at. Right? I mean, most countries now, in order to ensure livelihoods, and basic requirements, will need to ensure health security, will need to ensure food security. And does that redefine and change the priorities that we've had so much for a long period of time given towards urbanized community? The urban classes, I mean, I can give you an example, and then we can ask, Professor Lipika to come in, is I've been talking to a lot of the farmers nearby, and, the farmers completely changed their cropping pattern almost, I would say, a decade ago, because a lot of the farmers were producing vegetables, fruits, that were largely going to Azadpur Mandi, which is basically the closest market where they're selling their massive products. That was not possible during this lockdown because they couldn't transport their goods. And this is the point that Mara made. The lockdown and the concept of this lockdown, it's very interesting because Brazil never had the same, let's say, curfew style lockdown that India has had. Because we had just shut down everything, a lot of farmers started contemplating to localize their supply chains. So our own society, let's say, had RWA members trying to source supplies of vegetables from local farmers nearby. But a lot of the farmers were not producing these products. And the irony, the ironical point is that the state was trying to ensure supplies of food grains as part of its buffer stocks. But a lot of people were asking me this question, the rural community, how do we cook? We don't have oil, like the cooking oil. We don't have the gas connections that are there as part of it. So what are we going to do with rice and and pulses, right? So I think what is happening is that while there are targeted schemes and interventions that have been provided, as you pointed out, that Kerala's example shows us any state which has been able to ensure social security, food security, and employment security in conjunction to each of these points as matter of state priority has been able to respond to the crisis A in a better manner, right? And at the same time, ensured workers stay, because I highly doubt, and I mean, just a point that it is important to mention, I spent 3 hours the other day walking around the Connaught Place and the entire region, Karol Bagh, just observing each and every space. We used to go earlier for our market recce visits, basically to identify these locations. Not even a single vendor is available there to be able to sell their produce. There's no one. It's basically everything is decimated. So, which means to say that either most people are gone. The second question is, well, what has happened to them, and what kind of incentives do they have to return? And I think that's a big question to ask, not only as social scientists. But I'll come back to this. Lipika, if you could come in, please share your own thoughts, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dipanshu. It was actually great listening to all other panelists. And in fact, some of the comments that I'm going to make build upon those. Just to start with the question of, so I'm basically, I'm discussing three different questions that Dipanshu sent to me. So I'll take up the first one, which is to identify some of the socio-political ramifications of the lockdown in India. And let me just pick up on the point about the welfare state there, and how closely the welfare state is connected to electoral politics in India, because the claims for welfare resources play a very important role in how people decide to vote. However, let me come back to that. But I think with respect to the state, a crucial shift, which had been a long time in the making, but has now become much more apparent, is a rise of a kind of surveillance state, where different kinds of technology would be used to track citizens, and world over, states are trying that, and with the pandemic, it became a necessity, to be able to track those who were infected and to stop further infection. The worry here, however, is that we need that kind of strong state which is able to keep tabs. But the question that I just want to throw open here is whether this would outlast the pandemic. And my sense is that it would. And what would it then mean, for the relation between the state and its citizens? So that's one social political implication that I wanted to highlight, which is to do with the nature of the state and what the state would look like in a post-pandemic world, whenever that comes. The other thing, which is slightly more specific to India, is how with the pandemic we noticed there to be a greater division, a greater solidification of boundaries between the different states, that states would seal their borders, so traveling between states, which was not a worry before, was now difficult. And connected to that, the other sort of social scientific implication that I think we need to think more about is the connection between the urban and the rural. Because, Akriti, for example, mentioned how the urban is really fragile, and the rural still might continue to be resilient in the face of a pandemic like this. But when we talk about internal migration, much of this internal migration is circular migration, because people come and go. And in fact, around where our university is located in Haryana, we often see migrant workers coming over only in certain seasons, when it's the time to sow the crops or the time to harvest the crops, when more manpower is needed. So in many ways, do we now see there to be a greater division between the urban and rural, whereas earlier it was, somewhat continuous? Are we moving then, from sort of circular migration to a more linear form of migration where, either you cannot leave, or once you leave, it's difficult to come back? So Sugandha mentioned that, people are in fact, because of the precarious situation, wanting to come back to the cities. So we need to see how this pans out, and that will really affect how we think about the relationship between the urban and the rural from now on. The third thing that I want to mention in terms of implications for society and politics is, class divisions becoming much more apparent. It's not like they were not there before, but given the need to stay home, who has a home and what kind of a home do people have? In terms of access to healthcare, okay, the government healthcare facilities are overloaded, but those who have the money can then access the private hospitals, whereas those who don't cannot. So this class division in many ways is becoming starker ever since this pandemic has started, which is not to say that, if the class division is more stark, divisions of religious and caste-based nature are going away. With respect to caste, of course, we are a society which talks about purity and pollution, and several accounts of historians who talk about the arrival of Western medicine and notions of cleanliness and hygiene, and how those very neatly got mapped on to caste divisions in India. We are sort of seeing a rerun of that in many ways. With respect to religion, we all know in the initial period in like late March, when the disease was in the initial phase of spreading in India, how it was sort of after the Tablighi Jamaat incidents, it was seen as a Muslim virus, and particularly digital media. And some of my work looks at WhatsApp, so I've seen that closely, how there was a kind of racialization of the virus. This was happening world over, but in India, it was specifically religious in many ways. And the idea was that if you avoid people of a certain religion, you might be able to avoid the virus, which of course is not true. The fourth implication, which I don't know whether I can give a proper answer to, and this leads me to the second question, whether there would be any electoral implications of the pandemic, and particularly the crisis of migrant workers. So as Dipanshu mentioned in the beginning, we have elections coming up in two states, Bihar first in September or October. Both states are in Eastern India, and Bengal sometime early next year. And both these states have a large number of migrants who travel for work and live in other parts of the country. So when we see the preparations for these elections, particularly by the ruling party, the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is led by our Prime Minister Narendra Modi, we see that they've already started digital rallies, and there are television sets which have reached even the remotest of villages. In fact, the recent incursion by China also led to a situation where a large number of soldiers who were from Bihar were killed, and he sort of spoke about that in his speech. There are clear indications of trying to woo back the migrant workers who might have been disaffected by the current government, because in India, especially in the last few years, everything in many ways revolves around processes of electoral democracy. So even in the middle of a pandemic, the ruling party is thinking about how to win the next election more than anything else. So of course the question is whether, and this is what a lot of political analysts are talking about, is whether these migrant workers who have gone back home actually be the reason why the BJP would sink in a state like Bihar, that, given how migrants were treated, they are less likely to vote for the BJP, and opposition parties might benefit. Now, of course, the BJP, I think, is well aware of it, because the recent measures in Sugandha's, one of Sugandha's slides, I saw the Garib Kalyan Rozgar Abhiyan, which is to provide temporary employment to migrant workers. And in Bihar, it has been, I think the scheme would stay in effect for 125 days, which is sometime in October, and probably will cover the election period. So it's been announced in 6 states, but only in Bihar, it covers the largest number of districts. So it covers 32 out of 38 districts in Bihar. In the other states where the scheme has been announced, it does not cover so many districts. And of course, I think there's a plan to give employment as well as some cash transfers. Now we'll see how the scheme pans out, but you clearly see that, welfare measures are in many ways the go-to solution to seek votes. However, the elections are quite some months away, so we don't know whether, the migrant crisis will actually have any implications. We all saw in 2016 with demonetization how the government sudden decision by the government actually affected a lot of poor people, and yet in the very next election in the northern state of Uttar Pradesh, the BJP wins. However, in this case, there is a slight difference, I feel, where with demonetization, the government was successful at selling the idea that this is for the larger common good. Here too, they would have said that the lockdown is for everyone's good, which in some ways it was. But with that emerging, with the class divide emerging much more strongly, you actually see that there would be a greater disaffection here. I've read certain media reports, I think the print covered it, and they did a report earlier this month where they interviewed a lot of migrant workers who were trying to go home. And what they expressed really is this sense of betrayal. Where they were saying that, we voted for Modi, but now Modi has completely abandoned us. So, this sense of abandonment, I think, was not there before in such a large proportion. And I think this boils down to the idea of a kind of populist leader who takes along the people. Now, if we have to go back to conceptual terms, one key category in populism is that of the people. And of course, it's a mythical category because, you can construct it in whatever way possible. Now, with a large number of migrant workers feeling as if they are outside this construction of the people, or the people to whom the government wants to cater, this election would actually be a bigger test for the BJP, which sort of likes to win in all states. Of course, here I must point out that, in the 2019 national election, even though the BJP won a huge majority, the results in the states right after the state elections, which happened in a few months from the national election, were quite different. They were not able to win in all states. So people also vote differently at the state level and at the central level. So, even if it's difficult to say what the implications really would be, I think it'll be interesting to see. And the other thing that would be very peculiar about this election is that it might likely be the first such election where election campaigning only happens at a digital level. I've been doing some research earlier on the role of WhatsApp in elections and in politics before. And often people, and particularly in rural parts of the country, people have pointed out that, no matter how many messages you receive on your smartphone, and no matter how many messages you get on WhatsApp, from different political parties. It's actually door-to-door campaigning which is the most important. Now, in a situation where door-to-door campaigning would not happen, how and in what ways would parties reach out to people, and whether that would actually impact the election results remains to be seen. And of course, election results depend on a variety of factors, and we'll see how much this idea of Modi abandoning the poor might play out. Now, I'll move on to the last question, which is to do with the gradually eroding safety nets for workers, and whether an increase in subcontractual work would mean that there's greater collective action, or there is an opening of a political space where workers and the marginalized might be able to challenge political authority. Now, in some ways, one would like to think that it would, but given the precarity of the situation, at least I feel doubtful, because most of the people are quite helpless and very desperate in this situation. So that makes it very difficult to organize. And in addition to that, in the last 2 or 3 decades, there have been very few instances of sustained collective action. In 2018, November, I think there was a big farmers rally that took place in Delhi, and something of a similar nature has not happened after that, and that it has not been sustained in a way. Now, in the case of India, what is also particularly important to note is that marginalized groups often express their displeasure through voting in elections, and the work of anthropologist Lipika has in some ways demonstrated that, where she talks about how the poor and marginalized vote much more than the elites, because they have a lot more at stake in terms of who they vote for or not, because it is about a politics of claim making there. Partha Chatterjee's often repeated idea of political society gives us one answer here, where he talks about how the marginalized might take extra legal measures or make claims rather than taking a rights-based approach, which is sort of seen as limited to just the civil society, which is seen as a much more posh or educated class of people populating it. So what subalterns would do instead is to negotiate. So you negotiate with the state, you negotiate with employers, you negotiate with elected representatives. You don't resist, but you negotiate. Of course, I mean, the question then arises is how far apart are negotiation and resistance from each other? I won't go into that right now, but another key reason why political action of a collective nature has not happened in the recent past is because of the fact that the state is very central in every sphere, and that includes regulating how capital accumulation takes place. Forgive me for bringing in Partha Chatterjee once again, but in a 2008 article on democracy and economic transformation in India, he reiterates a similar point from his political society work, where he says that it's actually processes of electoral democracy which are the field of political negotiation. So it's unacceptable for any government to leave workers high and dry, to not ensure that they get employment, to not ensure that they get some kind of welfare available to them. He was writing this after the massive National Rural Employment Guarantee Act was instituted in India, but even in the case of lockdown, as Sugandha also mentioned, initially the government did not think that they have to plan some kind of a support package. But later it was felt that they needed to, and particularly, as I mentioned, in a state like Bihar where elections are coming up, they feel that it's important to spread it as much as possible. But yet, I think going back to one point that Dipanshu made, by stating that, we all need to be self-reliant, the Prime Minister has also sort of indicated that we move to a more laissez-faire kind of approach where the state is not responsible for you all the time. And the question which now then arises is that, the social contract between the marginalized and the state might now might well be rethought at this point, because do they need to then rely on the state always? That's one. And the state maybe wants to not give them everything, not that it was giving it, but it was at least claiming to help them out. So in the light of this changing social contract, will the model of capitalist accumulation change as well? And this shift, if it occurs, might as well have implications for political action, because you are no longer in a social contract where you trust the state to provide for you, and when you're casting your vote, that is what is running in your head. So now that the social structures are changing, socio-economic cleavages are becoming much more apparent and even deepening, and the government wants to do only the minimal for the marginalized. It remains to be seen whether that can in fact spur greater collective political action on the parts of, say, workers, peasants, and other marginalized groups. We won't have a clear answer to this right now, and given that we are in a situation where there's a great deal of economic precarity, I don't see it coming anytime soon. But I think this is something we need to keep track of. So I'll stop here for the time being, and hope to have some of these points come up again in the discussion.
Oh, thank you so much, Lipika. I think that's so well, brought in light to the kind of likely ramifications that are socio-political, what we're seeing right now, and I think what is likely to surface, especially with, I think the Bihar elections would be the first likely slap in the face of the current regime. I think that is more or less likely to be the scenario. But the concern has been that I think there is this important concept of electoral consumerism, that is, that I often keep using, that has now embedded itself, that there is a choice architecture or a choice basket every voter is looking for. And somebody asked this question, we're going to come back to that question later, that why the rural sector that Akriti mentioned earlier seems to be more resilient as against the urban one. And I think that's a good question to ask, but one have to look at, if you go and talk to people in the rural communities, they almost feel that a lot of them are on their own. The state's access and measures of social security and economic security have not reached to them in over all these years. So what is that is going to change now? All right, we'll have Dr. Swargajyoti coming in. She's a final speaker for today, and I think this discussion on looking at border aspects around our borders are no longer related to sovereign borders, but also the questions of interstate mobility that Lipika was mentioning too. And we'll then switch to, there are a number of excellent questions. So what I'm going to do is ask each one of you to be aware of what questions. I'll read out the questions and tell you what your questions are, and we'll get then responses from each one of you towards the close. Please, Dr. Swargajyoti, proceed. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm keeping my video off because my internet connection is a bit unstable, so I hope you can all hear me. So the brief that I was given was to talk about border communities, but I thought I would not limit myself only to speaking about border communities, because we've been talking about the different levels of borders throughout this panel discussions. So what I thought that I should focus on is the different kinds of borders and the different levels of borders that this pandemic has made more visible. First of all, is the international borders. We saw that when the pandemic began, and of course before lockdown even happened, many countries became very protective about its borders. And now we have a list of around 150 countries.
Dr. Gohain, could you be just slightly louder if that's possible? Thank you. Okay. Just you're fine. Just be a little louder with this, please. That's
right. It's just my internet connection is not so good, I think. So
yeah.
I hope it's audible now. Is
yeah, perfect.
All right. So what I thought and what struck me when the pandemic started to make its way around the globe was that how nations reacted by closing their borders, how sea routes, land routes, how flights were cancelled, and visa rules were rewritten, and other kinds of restrictions were put in place to stop cross-border movement. And this was such a, ironical thing, because we have a pandemic, which is, pan-epidemic, which is happening because of cross-border movement and the kind of, intense global movements that we have. And so the response has been its opposite, to shut down all the borders and to shut down all kinds of movement and migration. And I think, if I was not audible, 150 nations have changed their visa rules. So and it was not as if only, flights, passengers or immigrants were coming by flights, but those people who would migrate, who would cross borders daily for different, for access to food, for access to, for work opportunities, even those everyday migrations were stopped. For example, the Venezuela-Colombia border, and so many other borders where daily migrations would be a matter of fact of life for everyday kind of a fact, that were stopped. So what this showed to me was that the discourse of borders, which has become so prominent, and the discourse of borders is about open borders, about cross-border cooperation, about cross-border movement. That discourse has become so fragile. There are research clusters, there are conferences which are organized about how about regional cooperation, about cross-border cooperation, and about theorizing open borders. And very famously, there was this Dutch political geographer who said, Henk van Houten, who said that borders should be treated like doors, not walls, implying that people should move across the world. People should move towards more porous borders. But the pandemic has actually brought to us the reality of borders. And this implies also the continuing relevance of nationalism and national identities. So once again, the discourse of borders, of open borders, implies that the nation state has a loosening hold. And I have always been uncomfortable with this view, because I work in a disputed border area where the nation state's presence is very visibly felt, because of course these are highly militarized regions. It's a disputed area. I work in the India-China border, not the western one, but the eastern one. So we would assume that the talk of the discourse of borders, which of all its discourse about opening up and all, although it kind of forces us to emphasize a global community. It's a very privileged and highly classed and highly unequal one, but nonetheless a global community which is taking place. But then COVID has brought home the realities of these borders. So I think it has redrawn again boundaries of belonging, especially national belonging, because only citizens and permanent residents are allowed entry everywhere. There's a material angle to it too, because here we can think about how nation states, again, we've been talking about welfare state, but how this is so integrally related to the closing of borders. This is actually very evident in one nation's visa policy. For example, Cambodia, it has a rule which it started after March 30, which does allow entry to foreigners, but on the condition that they have to have a medical certificate which states that they have tested negative for COVID 72 hours before flying, and that they have health insurance cover, minimum health insurance cover of $50,000. So this clearly shows that the government, that how does nationalism enter the picture here. And at a smaller scale, we saw this in our own Delhi, where Delhi government's proposal to reserve Delhi's hospitals only for the residents of Delhi. So what I want to highlight is that the reality of borders also has this very material angle to it. And I want to connect it with the debates between the citizens and refugees, or the immigrants, which had led to countrywide protests just before the pandemic started. And actually the pandemic then stopped all these protests because of course social distancing. So those protests in a way it was against the government's policy, the citizen amendment bill, but it was also about this tension between natives and immigrants, between citizens and refugees. And this tension, these anxieties, which have a material angle to it. I mean, our jobs, the citizens or the natives think that we have first rights. as kind of first comers, because immigrants are assumed to be second comers, they came later. So as first comers, we somehow have more rights to the nation's resources. So this actually is the basis of many of these anxieties and these tensions between immigrant and native. So the pandemic has again allowed certain, states with ultranationalist ideologies to rake up these tensions once again. So we have the Trump administration in US now, announcing that it has temporarily suspended H-1B visas and work visas. So the pandemic actually resurrects these anxieties, or some states try to play on these tensions between native and foreigner. So it has also, as many scholars have said, the pandemic has enabled governments to indulge in authoritarianism, and as some of the speakers have pointed out, majoritarianism of different kinds, whether it is of race or whether it is of religion, and of course, class too. The second meaning, or second visible borders that the pandemic brought up is, of course, what all the speakers have been talking about, the internal borders within nations, which is interstate migrations, very forcefully brought up. And again, here we could see how all the state governments felt compelled to act, or at least show that they are working to preserve or at least protect their migrants, and to act protective about their workers. In fact, this took an extreme kind of view when the Uttar Pradesh government announced that after the pandemic is over and when migrant workers are ready to return to their workplace, the receiving states should then ask the UP government for permission before they recruit UP workers. So what this shows again is that how the continuing paternalism that exists between the state and our subjects. I mean, the people of this country are not rights-bearing citizens, but they are, they have ties of dependency on the state. So it kind of resurrects again these points. Authoritarianism, state paternalism, and national identities have become even more visible during the time of the pandemic. Another border that we have seen is, of course, what Akriti also talked about, and several of you talked about, are urban borders, or the gated communities, or the RWAs, the Resident Welfare Associations, which took on policing roles. So in the case of the domestic workers that Akriti mentioned, in Mumbai there was a case where one RWA of a gated community decided that the domestic help, the maids, would not use the elevators, but they would use the steps. So even if this meant climbing 13 flights of stairs. So all these kinds of borders, national, international, state level, and also urban borders resurfaced with a greater intensity during the pandemic. So my last point, which is actually about the border communities, is actually about the physical border. So what is happening in the physical border regions? Now, this is a question that's very interesting because, what the fate of anthropology, or the fate of ethnographic work, field work, has become very unpredictable because of the lockdown and the restrictions on travel, whether it is self-imposed or the fear of COVID. So this has actually led to a lot of changes in the methods of anthropology too. We are not physically able to go to our field sites to study what is happening there, because most of the time our field sites are very far away from where we reside, and this requires a lot of travel. So, but so that's one, actually it relates to the kind of problems that areas in the border, which are often remote, and they're remote not just because they are far away from the center or from Delhi, but also because they are cut off in various ways, because they do not have proper communication, they do not have proper transportation, and they also do not have other kinds of infrastructure. And that problem, the problem of infrastructure that border communities face, is something that has only become intensified during the lockdown period and during COVID, because it is not something that was ever absent. It has always been there. Lack of infrastructure is a defining characteristic of these so-called, remote areas, whether it is schools, hospitals, roads, supplies. All these have been a problem in border areas. So I was recently, chatting to a PhD scholar who's doing her PhD on climate change from Sussex University, and she happened to be doing field work in Tawang, that is in Arunachal Pradesh, which also happens to be my field site. And she was trapped; she could neither come out, and she only proved, Miss Iris Ruyulin, she only proved the extent to which the effects of lockdown, which were felt by all of us across the country, how this was kind of exacerbated in the border regions. Now we talk about transport and communication. Well, roads have always been bad in these areas. The transport was stopped. People, of course, there was no way to get out unless there was government intervention. Schools and education have, we've been reading about how online education has not been a solution for many of India's poor and for many of India's rural population, because they do not have access to the resources that will allow them to go online for education. So in Tawang too, there was, of course, online schooling, online education, and often there would be power cuts. And even if people had smartphones, they would not have good mobile connection. And in the absence of formal schooling, of course, there was no way that their parents could homeschool them, because the parents also did not have that level of education. Now, hospitals have always been a problem in Tawang. In fact, in Tawang, there's only one district hospital. And I think a couple of years ago, there was an army hospital which was built. But many of these hospitals do not have the infrastructure to treat patients. I mean, leave alone helping them get better. So they would not have oximeters, for example. They would not have any, even beds. I assume in many remote areas, it's the same condition. In fact, in Assam, in Guwahati, the state, Assam is the state which I come from. So in Guwahati, a lockdown has been declared from tomorrow again, because the health minister says that there are no beds in the hospital. So if there are no beds, we cannot afford to let people fall sick. So I mean, these are the kinds. I mean, Assam is also kind of by some stretch, it is also a border region, vast border region. So if you look at all these different borderlands, you can see how infrastructure, the problems of infrastructure, we talk about the breakdown of infrastructure, health infrastructure. The health infrastructure system has collapsed in Delhi. We talk about that, but that's actually quite compounded to an unimaginable level in the border areas. One, I think, important point to also mention here is that most of these areas, and I'm thinking about Tawang in Arunachal Pradesh and also Ladakh, which is now the center of a lot of attention because of the conflict between India and China, which is ongoing there. So all these regions, these are high altitude areas, Himalayan areas, which whose the mainstay of whose economy rests on tourism. So after almost 3 to 4 houses, there will be a hotel or a family-run guest house or a homestay. And even shops, the kind of merchandise that shops sell are oriented towards the tourist. Cab drivers ply their taxis because they earn good income during the tourist season. So all this, I mean, beginning March is the tourist season in many of these areas. So this has suffered a huge loss due to the pandemic. So there are the community level efforts to contain the spread of the virus, and also community sanctions against people who violate these sanctions. But eventually, the kind of losses that are being experienced in these regions are not yet apparent. They're not even coming to the mainstream. One has to actually, since one can't go to those areas, one has to actually call up people, and sometimes calling is also not possible because it's also the season, rains have started and networks are even more difficult there. So the infrastructure, which has always been a problem, has actually become even more of a problem now. So what I actually would like to say in terms of a methodological suggestion is that when we look at borders and COVID, or the impact of COVID on borders, I would like to think about the impact at all these different levels, at all these various levels, and how the border kind of uh, it becomes so visible in all these different levels. And that is one way to approach borders, actually, because it's such an abstract concept. How do you operationalize it? How do you study it? How do you look at, understand it, except by seeing that it is not a single thing, but it is multi-layered, it is multiple meaning, and it has different levels. And so, I mean, there is something that I want to also talk about, which might seem a little removed from this, the immediate topic that was given to me. I came across this very nice term in the Indian Express yesterday called the anthropos. So there are scholars in London who have come up with this new term called the anthropos, which is a combination of anthropos, humans, and pause. So the great lockdown is also seen as this great pause in human activity. Then we're talking about the social impact of the pandemic in this panel, but we also have to see the environmental impact, and how the social and the environmental are all kind of connected. And this I say because it has a relevance to the war that is going on. So anthropos is this term that researchers have talked about or invented to look at, how the lack of human activity, how the recession of humans or human kind of human activities have actually led to uh, different kinds of activities among wildlife. Wildlife are seen in urban areas, wildlife are seen in never before seen places, because COVID is, of course, an outcome of the environmental interference of human beings. Now, what relation does it have with the war that we are seeing in a border area? So there's this article by two Australia-based academics, Ruth Gamble and Alexander Davis, who talked about how areas such as Ladakh or even Tawang, which are very high altitude regions, where who have which have been included in maps of India through cartography. In many cases, people have not actually been to those areas because the borders in these areas is very difficult to actually pin down borders here. Because the landscape is always changing, because these are very ice capped landscapes and seismic zones. So the landscape also changes. So how do you demarcate borders in an ever-changing landscape? So one kind of wishful suggestion, which hopefully could also be a realistic suggestion, is that many of these high altitude areas should be demilitarized. There should be a demilitarized zone where no army should be allowed to establish any bases, because we know that the military has been a great contributor to environmental degradation. The firing ranges of military needs, the kind of build up or establishment of army settlements and army camps in high altitude regions, these are all contributing to environmental destruction. So can we then think about demilitarization of the border regions? Because eventually we're talking about COVID, and if COVID is a result of the human interference in the environment, and militarization contributes to environmental degradation, and we see the kind of military build up in border areas, especially now during a pandemic, when people are already at their wits end, and especially in Ladakh, people already are fighting a pandemic, they're fighting COVID, and to top that, now they have a war and the fears of a war to also deal with. So can we not think about demilitarization? So I realize that I have kind of shifted away from the main topic, but
No, yeah.
to
No, but this was fascinating. This was fascinating, and you touched upon some of the aspects that a colleague of mine and me, Dr. Samrat and me, we just talk about these exact set of issues when we go out in the field. And you're totally right. Unless you don't go in the locations that you're speaking of, in high altitude areas, even within the Indo-Bhutan area, the Indo-Bangladesh area, an area like Devasari, Hatisar in the case of Kelimfu, Bhutan. I mean, these are all spaces which throw up a very different world and a very different set of reality. So, I mean, thank you so much for that. So we have, I mean, we have time. It's not as if that we have around 15 minutes of time to be able to respond to questions that have come in. So I want to take this chance to just read out the questions for each one of you. I have segregated the questions based on who is able to respond to these. And what I'd request you to do is take a couple of minutes to just respond to these questions. And when I say couple of minutes, that means I think time yourself to around 2.5 minutes of response, and we'll wrap up by 6:15. So thanks a lot, guys, for waiting in for your questions and and thank you to the panelists for excellent remarks. But these sessions, as I have to say, we can listen and educate ourselves from perspectives, or we can deliberate and have active deliberation. So I mentioned this in previous sessions that this is the purpose of these sessions, is to educate and make ourselves aware on different perspectives. That's the purpose of doing this, which is very different from what Samvad, which is now the new identity of Politica within the center, is going to do. And we have a very special guest coming in next week, so I'll talk a little bit about it when we close. Anyway, let me start with Akriti. Akriti, you have a few questions that were coming in. So I just want to read the questions and you can make a note and just respond to these as a turn comes in. The first question is by Ayushi: why has the rural economy not been affected by the pandemic? Is your argument that the nature of the rural economy is not capitalistic, quote unquote, in the same way as the urban? Okay, that's one question by Ayushi. Another question by Ananya Agarwal for Akriti. That's on the question of portability of ration card issue. She was not able to understand what you were trying to say on accessibility of ration cards. And I think just to probably, I think rephrase it in the sense of what better can be done to ensure social security to the vulnerable groups. I think Ishita asked this question on how the HIV positive workers, particularly those within the sex worker community, could get access to basic medical care around this time. And I don't know if you want to comment on something that you could have known. Siddharth has asked this question, which I'll ask Akriti to respond, is post-COVID, do you see that the nature of state would tilt further towards a welfare state? So I don't know what kind, you could probably see what kind of a welfare state are you likely to see going forward? That's a question I'd asked earlier. Sugandha, there's a question by Abhishek Kumar. I want to just echo that for you. I think it's a big question, but it's an important question, which is also you were getting at. So maybe you could respond to this. The pandemic has laid bare the problem of the effects of disenfranchisement and consequent loss of bargaining power of the migrants. Would we be seeing a total unraveling of the neoliberalism and opening up of newer spaces for populist forces or for the governments to become more responsive and work for better contracts and treat migrant workers with more respect without tagging them as quote unquote poor in the policies, right? So more like a conceptual question on framing of regulation and access to social security. Mara, we have a couple of interesting questions for you, and I hope we could take this. The first question is, I mean, these are both questions from Harsha Jain. On the picture about the current situation of labor markets, formal, informal in Brazil, has been painted. What does the near future of laborers in the labor market look like in your country? And what direction will policy for the same have to take? Another question that Harsha asks, and I think that Mara can take up, is what kind of a synergy can one expect between the social sector, the economic market, and the government in revamping outcomes for the marginalized? Does such a triangular nexus even, the word used is nexus, okay, so that's interesting, even seem possible in the given political context? Okay, good questions. Lipika, you have a couple because as soon as you touch about electoral dynamics here, a lot of people come up with interesting questions. So Sahil has, Tarini has this question. Good evening, Professor. Oh, sorry, that was me. My question to Professor Lipika is, how will lockdown impact voter turnout in your understanding? Because I think right now there's this discussion having postal ballot for senior citizens, and that's likely to be tested with the upcoming elections. How do you see that is going to affect? And voter turnout in India has been already very low across many states. How do you see that happening? And won't that be hindered, which may advantage the ruling party? Sahil has asked this question again for Lipika. One of the reasons why there was an unnerving apathy shown by the state to the migrants was because they didn't constitute a major part of the vote bank. This mainly arose because of the fact that they could never go back to their home state. How does this change various political parties' stance with respect to the situation of the migrants with the current situation panning out and coercing the migrant to stay in their hometown, taking the case of Bihar. So let's say the focus is on retaining them there as against letting them go back. Ayushi has asked this question, which I request Dr. Swargajyoti to take, is this question on how can rights-based discourses be made different from state dependency? Can rights exist without the inclusion/exclusion binary of national and citizenship ties? I have a small question I'm gonna put into Dr. Swargajyoti as well, which is the expansion of this imagery of borders that you were seeing as doors and walls. I had a completely different imagery in mind, which is that of mirrors. And mirrors, from the perspective of a worker who, let's say from Faridabad or a neighboring satellite town, Ghaziabad, comes to the city, he or she sees the main city from the perspective of a mirror where there is this higher aspirational consumption driven objective of higher well-being, but the other person looking at the other side of the mirror cannot see this side. You remember these high intelligence mirrors where you can see very totally the kind of imagination that you want to create. I think those are very interesting at site of borders. I used to see this particularly in the border area in the Indo-Bhutan side, that India's border side was used for all consumption of refrigerators, air conditioners. It's so fascinating. You'll go to a completely undifferent territory, has no roads, has nothing, and then you have suddenly a market which has all the fancy mobile phones, refrigerators, air conditioners, because all people from Bhutan who couldn't buy these products there back in Galimfu and Thimphu would come towards this region to buy. So are we likely to see that this aspirational structure of the social beings is likely to kind of change? People are going to be happy with less the sustainability discussion goes into degrowth a lot. So maybe just to respond to that would be wonderful. We have some time, as I said. I will request to start in the reverse ordering. So we'll start from let's start from Akriti, because you've been quiet for a long time. Please go ahead. Mute yourself. I haven't muted you.
Am I audible now?
Yeah.
Yes, so rural resilience, of course. So having understood heterogeneity and labor market segregation and systemic exclusions within the rural society as well, be it caste and other kinds of relationships, I would still want to go back to the Gandhian idea of Gram Swaraj. I think that is where the answer lies. The reality is somewhere in between. But I wouldn't say that it's like that it's absolutely non-capitalistic. It's market integrated, of course. But the whole idea of village as a self-sustaining society where local production, local consumption, and lesser dependence on the outside is what is perhaps making it immune to not just taking in virus or others, but also, the other ramifications, the socio-economic and socio-political ramifications that is happening majorly in urban spaces due to heavy dependence on large capitalistic market integrations that globalization, opening up the globalization, and all these LPG reforms has brought into. So I think that is how we need to look at why the rural perhaps is also showing us the way of how rest of the economy and rest of the country should also actually be taking a path of a similar kind. So a little optimistic there. Um, Coming back to the question of portability of ration card. So yes, the challenge that we found was that people had their ration cards back in their villages, which were applicable only to procure ration from a PDS in the countryside, and they were not able to use the same ration card, or maybe it was in the name of some other family member. So, so the point being here that what one would really this also answers the other question of HIV positive access, I mean health access, healthcare access, and the whole larger question of welfare state. So I think 3-4 things that we must really, so it's a normative response, should go to is towards nationalization of healthcare, nationalization of PDS, that is food security, nationalization of employment guarantee. So here, of course, we know that it's only right now Rural Employment Guarantee Act. It's high time that we really consider it, that it comes to the city, and 150 days of employment guarantees extended to much more, at least 300 days. Now it's a very challenging thing at this point, but that is where our demands should actually go towards, to actually be able to look at and cater to the current crisis of unemployment and others as well. Now the question will be in terms of the affordability, viability, feasibility, and I think we can actually discuss upon those. There could be multiple ways of the profit that they're making with the oil price caps, what's happening with the the super rich inheritance of wealth tax, and the taxing system. There are ways of actually looking at how financial viability can happen, and Dipanshu, of course, can actually also respond to that. So I think it is very imperative now that this post-COVID world is indeed much more welfare-driven, something that we have been claiming constitutionally and otherwise, that we actually in practice uphold those, and political, electoral and all other routes will be ways of actually asserting and demanding those. And it's very important to have the movements also to take up on the streets eventually. I think that is where we can actually go towards a much more just and much more egalitarian society. So yes, we definitely need to make a shift truly to a welfare state, if not really a socialist one.
Yeah. Thank you. Mara, please proceed.
Thank you for the question, and thank you also for the other speakers for such interesting and deep kind of like analysis. I think it's a big question, obviously, like how the future of the labor market looks like. I can talk a bit about the immediate future, which I think it's a sort of like a bleak scenario, which is, we see, as I showed in the end, I think you couldn't see the PowerPoint, but the data that was just released a couple of days ago, showing increase in unemployment, decrease in incomes, and what that will create in the immediate future is further kind of more people moving from waged formalized jobs to informal work, and I think more people moving as well to the so-called platform gig economy. So that's the trend that's being observed not only in Brazil, but I think I know in India and in other countries, even in the so-called global north as well. People are working more and more for Uber, but like Deliveroo and Uber Eats and this kinds of platforms that have been kind of also work still relevant during the pandemic. So a lot of people could remain working, although sort of running the risk of contamination to keep their livelihoods. I think, as I said in the presentation, if there is anything positive about the situation, and it's still I'm still unsure if it will actually kind of like have positive consequences is that those kind of invisible workers have come to light in a way, right? Not that they were actually invisible, because you just have to walk on any city in Brazil to see street vendors and other types of workers in the streets and other places as well. So they sort of, for the first time in a long kind of like history, they've been somehow included in a policy, right? The emergency income has reached informal workers, and so that has kind of prompted discussions on universal basic income, which is a discussion that has existed in Brazil since the 70s. It kind of got lost once Brazil went into another path, which is the kind of like conditional cash transfers program that Brazil implemented in the beginning of the 2000s, the sort of Bolsa Família that is quite well known internationally. So the discussion of the sort of universal income that existed was a bit kind of has been a bit not that there's much discussion about this has been going on, but then because of the crisis, this policy has emerged again as a sort of like a way of dealing with the immediate consequences of the pandemic, but also the sort of long, probably term consequence that we would see after the lockdown and if the pandemic is actually controlled. What I see as positive as well is kind of like more bottom-up initiatives. So in my own research, so I've been working with street vendors at least since 2013. And I, at least in my field, what I see is that they are becoming more and more organized. And that means also, for instance, having conversations with academics. So I've been part of a group who is trying to elaborate a document that will kind of ask for policy measures for this particular group of workers. So you see some networks starting to emerge, asking for policy measures that are not the kind of policy measures that you would have in the past, which is attempts to formalize street vendors, which have been very unsuccessful in the past because they ignore completely the way that these economies work. So I think we might see in the future that I hope that this kind of initiatives that are kind of starting to get some fruition will eventually lead to policy measures which are a bit more innovative and a bit more encompassing than what we had in the past. But I think the immediate future is a bit bleak, unfortunately, and I think it's going to get worse before it gets better, and it will take a lot of sort of bottom-up organization and political organization from the sector to actually push for more sort of innovative and encompassing measures. And I hope this will happen.
Okay, Sugandha, please proceed.
Thank you very much for the question. I think that's an interesting question you ask in terms of what's going to happen with the bargaining power of workers. I think, again, at this point, as I said before, we don't know. I mean, that's the long and short of it. But as far as I can sort of speculate based on what I know so far, it seems that there are some spaces or some indications that there might be incremental changes, right? So when we talk, I mean, this is something I often talk to my students about: where do you want to locate or how do you want to measure change, right? So if you're talking about structural change, possibly not. But if you're talking about incremental change in terms of, the everydayness of it and what happens, when a worker is interacting with the employer and how it might sort of manifest itself in these kinds of interactions, then, I think that there would be, there are two sort of reasons why I feel that there might be some opening up of spaces in terms of negotiation. So one is what we see right now is that a lot of workers are coming back, are being called by the employers, are being ferried back, are being paid for to come back. Of course, one can ask that they didn't take care of them at that point, but of course, it's very strategic right now because they need to open up their factories, so they need the workers, right? So there's a greater demand, and that might mean that wages go up. So there is those two factors that make me a little bit optimistic about the spaces for negotiation increasing or expanding. But again, as I said, like there is no short way of, and I mean, economists might be better suited to respond to that. Perhaps Dipanshu wants to weigh in. Also, I think there's a state differentiated picture that might emerge. So for example, something interesting that's happening in Kerala is that, a lot of the Gulf migrants, people who migrate to the Gulf as labor migrants are returning back. So a lot of their local labor issue might be resolved by integrating those migrants into the economy. So they may not have to sort of get internal migrants back. So there is a sort of, I think it will differ from one state to another. There's also new labor laws that were proposed. So that might make the picture a little bit more complicated. But I mean, there are some indications that there might be an opening up of the negotiating space.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Lipika. I mean, just on the labor law issue, I'll say that I think Sugandha is much more optimistic about the scenario. Things are going completely in the reverse direction. There's more bargaining power at the hands of the employers right now as against the workers. And I think a few of us, we've been writing. Anybody who wants to read up or is interested, we could probably have. But we're planning to have a discussion focusing particularly on labor markets. And so let's see how that comes along. Please, Lipika, and then we have around 10 minutes.
Yeah, very quickly. I think the first question about lockdown impacting voter turnout, I don't know. I think it remains to be seen what kind of elections we will have in the middle of this, what the situation would be by the time elections happen in Bihar in September and October. So let's see that. On the second question, I think that's a very interesting question. Whereas earlier the government wouldn't do very much for the migrant workers because they were not voting in that particular state, to a situation where now they might actually be home where they can vote, because often they wouldn't be able to travel back to vote, though they would try to. But in Bihar, for example, if they don't come back to get back their older jobs or find new work, they are likely to be in their hometown, and number of migrants voting might be much higher than ever before in the election. And that might impact the election if that is the case. So yeah.
Yeah. Dr. Swargajyoti, please, your final words on this, please.
Very quickly, the future of rights-bearing citizens versus ties of dependency, was that the first question?
Yeah.
So it's already been touched on, especially by Lipika, that it's just a myth. I mean, we talk about citizenship and as rights-bearing citizens, but we've been hearing about so many kind of uneven, citizenships, and there have been also terms to talk about how citizenship is graduated, they're uneven, they're unequal, because everybody doesn't even get what they should be getting. And the counter to that has been all kinds of affirmative policies, but even that doesn't work. So unfortunately, it has been ties of dependency, which has been kind of working out. And so what is the answer to that? One would assume that the answer would be electoral politics and democracy, but then if democracy doesn't work, what would be the secondary step? We would look at institutions, but what if institutions break down? What would be the last resort then? So I'd kind of agree with Lipika that it's civil society initiatives or political society that eventually has to fight for the rights when the rights are not given. So it's a quick kind of opinion. And the second question about borders being is mirrors, how, we talk about, we have open borders often because they are acting out the mirror aspirations. One side wants to go to the other side because they feel that there are better opportunities, better goods, better, life standards there. So how do we then answer this in light of the pandemic, which has actually led to the closure of borders? I think this is tied to the larger question of what happens to regional cooperation, because we are talking about Asian, regional cooperation. We're talking about economic cooperation. All these are kind of buzzwords now globally. What are we going to do with this? So can we cut that down? Because I think this is linked to that, and that's a larger question of international policy. But in the immediate run, I think, of course, once borders open, this is not going to resume, sort of stop. And whether this, how does this tied up to our own kind of urges? I think that's again a very large question about sustainable lives and trying to practice less consumerism. That's a larger question that all of us all over the world should be debating about, because it is so evident that it is excessive consumption that has eventually led, and we cannot really be blaming China alone for for the virus, as many are trying to do. It's a trend of human beings intervening and destroying biodiversities and habitats and all that, which is, of course, which is a more serious question that has to be addressed by the global community.
Yeah, thank you. We'll have to probably close in just a minute or two, and just closing remarks. Thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time out and coming in for discussing your thoughts and perspectives. Two quick points. One is we're going to be planning, and maybe I think we'll be requesting Akriti to be able to record a small footage or a video on behalf of Pegam. Pegam is launching a new initiative called, I think, Swadharma, which is to empower communities, particularly those, and I think a lot of you know that street vendors used to use trailers and work for being able to do their business. So they're trying to support businesses to get back, and we will be doing, I think, targeted fundraising calls through the center's ID to all. This was not the platform to launch it, but just announce the measure. So Akriti, do you, I think maybe we would want to have you to record a video and you could send it to us. What we'll do is we'll share that in email, and you can add more details about what you guys are planning. I did get a chance to read through the entire thing. So we'll be doing that over the coming week. The final point I just wanted to make was we have one of the leading public intellectuals, Dr. Pratap Bhanu Mehta, coming next Saturday for an interaction. I'll be speaking to him. I've been communicating the questions. So we'll be making that open for all. So that will be our final scheduled interactive session for this particular term. We'll be starting with more dialogues with scholars across the board internationally and domestically as we begin in August. So I just wanted to make you update about it. And thank you, finally, everyone, for taking the time. Amara, thank you so much for taking time. The UK, Akriti, Sugandha, Swargajyoti, and Lipika. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks to you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.